being wrong. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
So for the baby boomer generation, which I am part of that generation, the song we just heard harkens back to the protest era of the 1960s. The refrain is, "Stop now, what's that sound? Everybody look, what's going down?" So I want to begin today by doing just that. What is that sound, and what has been going down? That sound is the voice of educators across the country rising up and saying, enough is enough. We're not going to take it anymore. It started earlier this year in West Virginia, one of the reddest states in the country. Then it spread to Kentucky and Oklahoma and Arizona. Again, all red states, all so-called right-to-work states. However, teachers and support staff have not been deterred. After years of budget cuts to education spending, they have had enough. Enough of being underpaid and underappreciated by elected officials. Enough of shoddy working conditions. Enough of out-of-date textbooks. Enough of their pensions being threatened. They stood up, they walked out, they rallied at their state capitals, they persevered, and they won. And not just for themselves. They won for their students, for their schools, and for the communities in which they live. In West Virginia, all state employees got the 5% raise given to educators. That was great. In Kentucky, the legislature restored school transportation funding and health insurance for recently retired teachers. And educators prevailed upon the Republican-controlled State House and Senate to override the governor's veto of a tax increase that helps to pay for increases in public education funding. In Oklahoma, teachers not only got a long overdue pay raise of about $6,100, but secured millions of dollars in new funding for the state schools. Pretty good. And in Arizona, where the governor had initially proposed a 1% hike in teacher pay, he signed a bill that increases those salaries by 9% this year and 5% in each of the next 2 years. That's incredible. And some of the $400 million in state cuts to education funding made in recent years were restored. None of this would have happened in any of these states if educators had not stood up, marched to their state capitals, and made their voices heard. Their actions have inspired all of us around the country. Let me take a moment to share some of their individual stories. Edwina Howard Jack, a high school English teacher at Upshur County, West Virginia, has taught for years. When West Virginia teachers began their walkout in February, she drove 2 hours to Charleston on 8 of the 9 days that protesters gathered at the state capitol. She told a reporter that she'd been more politically active since Donald Trump was sworn in as president, and I quote, "There have just been so many people who were apathetic before," she said, "but now want to get involved. And the teacher strike took it all to a whole new level." In Arizona, when Kathy Hoffman, who taught for 5 years, watched the Senate confirmation hearing for Betsy DeVos to be the U.S. Secretary of Education, she decided to run for state superintendent. She told a reporter that she was sick of people with no experience in education setting policy. Have we heard that before? Of course we have. And that was really the tipping point for her. That's the day it hit me that we really need more educators to run. In Oklahoma, Adlena Klontz, who's been an educator for more than 20 years, marched with her fellow educators and family members more than 100 miles from Tulsa to Oklahoma City, the state capital. She said she was motivated by the chance to do something for her special needs students. When she got to the Capitol, she found many lawmakers were, as she put it, not wanting to do their jobs, not wanting to really represent us. She's a Republican and a self-described active political party person, but she says she's had it and is now prepared to vote them out, Republicans and Democrats, if they're not doing their job. I quote, "Everyone wants these problems fixed," she said to a reporter, "and the questions for our leaders is, are you trying to do something about it?" We're going to remember in November has become the rallying cry as more and more educators are sending a clear message to the politicians. If you can't do what's right now for our schools, our students, and colleagues, we are going to vote you out. All of this activism has occurred at the same time that students have also said they've had enough. Enough of the horrific shootings that have taken place in too many schools across the country. Enough of living in fear that their school could be next. Enough of politicians not making it safer for them to study and learn. The tipping point came in the wake of the terrible shooting in February in Parkland, Florida, at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. There, a collection of brave, social media savvy students rallied their peers not only in their community, but across the country, including in Ohio, to demand action. More than 1 million people attended the March for Our Lives rallies in hundreds of cities across the country in March, including here in Columbus. The rallies attracted not just the students who want and deserve to have safe schools, but their parents and their teachers who marched in support. The Parkland students have galvanized a movement and spurred levels of activism not seen since the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s, movements that were also inspired by students. "These are the students we've been waiting for," said one activist whose mother was a second-grade teacher at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut when a mass shooting took place there in 2012. Now it's up to us to act. We all know it's an election year. Historically, our members have behaved much like the general electorate. Turned at the polls is usually not as great as during a presidential year, and it's less so when it's a so-called off year. The only exception to that pattern came in 2011 when the repeal of Senate Bill 5 was on the ballot. Well, the stakes this year are not unlike what we faced in 2011. The forces who oppose our collective bargaining rights, who oppose our basic right to organize, are itching to do us in. If we don't have a friend in the governor's office and other statewide offices next year, we're vulnerable to the attacks that have seen nearly all of the surrounding states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan among them, turned into so-called right-to-work states. If we act, if we mobilize in sufficient numbers, we can stop that from happening here. But we cannot be complacent. We need to turn out at the polls this year in record numbers. This afternoon, you'll hear from our friend Rich Cordray. I think many of you already know what he can do for us, our students, and working people across the state if he is elected governor. He can win. His opponent in the general election is coming out his primary weekend after having to fend off a challenge by pandering to the hard right element of his party. Mike DeWine's ability to appeal to voters in the middle, to the moderate voters who are the majority, has been diminished. And it is noteworthy that John Kasich has so far refused to endorse Mike DeWine. But we cannot take anything for granted. Rich Cordray will be vilified by the vested interests who can pour a lot of money into this state. They are desperate to cling to power. But I have a message for them, for all of them. We are not going to take it. We have had enough. Enough of treading water in the effort to invest more in our schools. Enough of the failure to make our schools safer. Enough of the denigration of public education by politicians who use us as a whipping post. And let's make it crystal clear to those people who want to hurt us. Let's join the hundreds of thousands of educators all across the country in saying enough is enough. Read our lips. We are not going to take it anymore. Thank you.
This one's for all the teachers out there tonight. Oh, we're not gonna take it. Oh no, we ain't gonna take it. Oh, we're not gonna take it anymore. We got the right to choose it. There ain't no way we'll lose it. This is our life. This is our song. We'll fight the powers that be just. I don't pick against the because you don't know us, you don't belong. We're not gonna take it. Oh no, we ain't gonna take it. We're not gonna take it anymore. We're not gonna take it. No, we ain't gonna take it. We're not gonna take it anymore.
I bet you didn't even know I knew who he was, did you? Okay? But who's going to join me in saying we're not going to take it anymore? We are not going to take it anymore. So thank you to all of you for all the work you've done so far and all the work I know you're going to join all of us in this room from now until November. Thank you.